without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Anton Garcia-Fernandez.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you everybody for being here. This should have happened 3 years ago, really. I was going to be delivering a lecture like this 3 years ago, but then the pandemic got in the way, and so I am here today. But I think it works better because, I've been working on this project for this book, and so this is what I'm going to talk about today, and I think it makes more sense to do it today. So the title is New Rhythms, Jazz in Spanish 20th Century Poetry, and I would like to start by reading my translation of a poem that my father, Antonio Garcia Teijeiro, included in one of his poetry collections, which was called In the Agony of Silent Autumn, so Na Agonía dos Outonos en Silencio. And this is a poem that has to do, among other things, with jazz. And my translation goes like this: erotic quietness on the bed where a solo by Coleman Hawkins lies on a night in which two beings came to understand the uselessness of killing love. So Coleman Hawkins is one of the great saxophonists in the history of jazz. The solo that the poem is talking about is More Than You Know, and this is a jazz themed poem in which the music is supposed to be heard on a radio in the background. And my father's record collection really was my first introduction to jazz when I was about 12, 13 years old, and his records, and then also radio shows like A Todo Jazz, and the albums that I soon began to spend most of my money on turned me into a lifelong jazz enthusiast. And it wasn't just that I was interested in listening to the recordings. I was also interested in reading and also interested in studying the liner notes, and I was soon reading books about jazz, not just the liner notes on the records, but also books and also literature that was shaped by the rhythms of jazz. And that is why I became interested in names that you would know, like Jack Kerouac, for example, the beats, the texts that Philip Larkin devoted to jazz, or the excellent writings on jazz by Ralph Ellison, for example. In France, there was Boris Vian and his very poetic criticism of jazz records. And I remember really reading works by the Paris-based Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar, like this one right here, El Perseguidor, which has a lot to do with the life of Charlie Parker, the saxophone player, and also Hopscotch or Rayuela, which is one of his most famous works and has a lot to do with jazz. But this really is one of my favorites by Cortázar, El Perseguidor, the chaser. Precisely, I like it in many ways precisely because of the jazz-related content of these works. So in my private life, I not only collect jazz records, but I also collect literary works that are inspired by jazz or shaped by the music in any of its various forms. So I think in many ways it was only natural that at some point I would take on a project like the one that I have been working on, a study of the presence of jazz in 20th century Spanish poetry, a book that should be published sometime in late 2023. Now, not a great deal of criticism has been written on the topic of Spanish poetry and jazz, even though, as we can see from this anthology here, Fruta Extraña, Casi un siglo de poesía española del jazz. This is an anthology of poems that in some way have to do with jazz, written by Spanish poets throughout the 20th century. Many were the poets, really, that were inspired by jazz to a greater or lesser extent to write some of their verses. And this tendency began with the avant-garde poets of the 1920s and the 1930s, and is still alive and very much healthy in the first quarter of the 21st century. I'm happy to report. Jazz is a music that amalgamates different styles and influences, but that is mostly African American in its inception. It originated in the United States, but soon spread to Europe, to other parts of the world, and it reached Spain for the first time in the late 19-teens, more or less at the same time that it was becoming popular in other European countries such as England or France. Sometimes critics say that everything arrives in Spain later than everywhere else. And in some cases this is true, but it was not true in the case of jazz. Of course, in these early years of the teens, 20s, 30s, it was more prominent in the bigger urban areas of Madrid and Barcelona. There is ample documentation of this, and for example, there are studies like El Jazz en Barcelona, or this one, which is in English, Jazz Age Barcelona. And the public became aware of the existence of jazz, not only due to a few touring bands from the United States, but also, although to a lesser extent, through 78 RPM records, and later, of course, the cinema. So what I want to talk briefly today, I'm going to show you some examples of these poems, is how the presence of jazz evolved over time from the 1920s up until the present day. And that really is what my book is about. So we're going to start with the poems with the poets from the 1920s and 1930s. As I said before, the first poets that became interested in jazz and used the music as inspiration for their compositions were those poets associated with the avant-gardes, los vanguardistas, because they saw the rhythms of jazz as a symbol of modernity, usually associated with dancing, with the urban medium. Many of them were also fascinated with African American culture in those days, or at least with what little they knew about African American culture. And in their texts, they reflect the emotions that the new music makes them feel. They celebrate, as George and Ira Gershwin would put it, the fascinating rhythm of jazz, and usually associated with the fast-paced rhythm of modern urban life. And we can see this, for example, in a very interesting essay by Ramón Gómez de la Serna entitled Jazz Bandismo. I once presented a paper at a conference specifically on this essay, and Ramón Gómez de la Serna says this about jazz in the mid to late 1920s. The fast pace of modern life, with its particular meningitis we need to put up with, is embraced by jazz. Jazz shows the speed of modern life, its absurdity, its incoherence, its wish for continuous fun. The main wisdom of jazz lies in embellishing a melody with trills, arpeggios, tremolos, variations, cadences, anything that its infrequent rhythm will allow. Mixing life and music like two oceans meeting through a very wide strait. So that's what Ramón Gómez de la Serna says about jazz in the 1920s. And, reading texts like this one, and many of the poems written in these early years, feels a little bit like listening to Shostakovich's Jazz Suite. I don't know if you've ever heard his Jazz Suite, but when you listen to that, it is really good. It's Shostakovich, of course. How could it not be good? But there is an interest in and a fascination with jazz in Shostakovich when he does, or when he composes the suite, even if the authors, Shostakovich and also the poets in Spain, don't really seem to know a great deal about jazz at that point. They like it, but they're not extremely aware of exactly what it is, where it comes from, and those kinds of things. Hardly ever, for example, do we find in the poems from the 20s and 30s any mention of specific musicians or specific tunes. Rather, jazz is associated with the city. It is associated with the nightlife, with dancing, with drinking. And the aspect of dancing is very important because jazz is seen as a music to dance to, which is what it was really in its inception. It has now become more of an academic kind of music, but it really was seen as the popular and dancing music of the period. And often, these poets make no distinction between jazz and other genres, such as tango, or dancing styles such as the cakewalk, or the foxtrot, the charleston, and many others. For them, it's all the same. Jazz and all those kinds of dancing is exactly the same. And often, jazz is used as an element of comparison when there is some kind of strident noise that's being described. For example, in the poem Jazz Band by Ramon Goy de Silva. And I have translated all of these poems myself into English because these poems have not been translated, most of them, into English before, because they're not very well known. So Ramon Goy de Silva wrote this poem. Party night, in the sky the stars turn on their signs. The moon, big and red, is a grotesque balloon. There are space rockets shining bright. A storm is coming, a great number of special effects. And so jazz is seen as, this noise that some people call music, but that is basically just strident and nice to dance to, but that's it. And so if there is a storm, like there may be coming up over here, then we compare it with jazz. And most of the time, jazz is related to the fast pace of the urban space of cities like Madrid and Barcelona, and of course, other parts of Europe. For example, in the poem A Car Passes By Xavier Bóveda, in which he links the noise of the city and its traffic with the noise of a band playing the foxtrot. So there's a lot of noises and sounds in that poem. And then something similar happens with a poem called Urban Landscapes by a woman named Lucia Sanchez Saornil. And this is what she writes about. She says, "The night in the city prepares its jazz band. The cars unwind their symphonic tapes along the avenues, tying our feet." Of course, this is a poem from the avant-garde, so the content of the poem has to do with the rhythm of jazz, but then the images have to do with things that rhythm of jazz suggests in the mind of this poet. There are also, and this is very interesting, I think, exceptions to this idea that jazz just has to do with modern life, with the urban space, with noises, because a poet like Jorge Guillén, for example, is, even in the 20s and 30s, already aware of the African-American origin of jazz, and uses this music, perhaps influenced, I think, by Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance, as a vehicle for social criticism, which, happened in the 20s, but then would keep on happening throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, and on in the history of jazz. But he's doing it here already, possibly influenced by the Harlem Renaissance, as a vehicle for social criticism and to speak against the oppression of the black people. Somebody in Spain talking about the oppression of the black people. That's Jorge Guillén. And using a line from Andy Rasaf's "What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue," which is a song that Louis Armstrong, here he is with W.C. Handy, recorded. He takes a line from that song that goes, "My only sin is in my skin." And Jorge Guillén writes this poem, "My sin is my skin." He doesn't say "in my skin," he says, "My sin is my skin," sings the black man in a beautiful, painful voice. Unexpected ending. Is Jesus Christ really going to be born at last? The white man is even whiter with shame. So the reference here, obviously, as I said, is to Louis Armstrong. When he says "sings the black man," he means Satchmo, he means Louis Armstrong, but he's using that song by Andy Rasaf, sung by Louis Armstrong as a point of departure to talk about certain things regarding the oppression of the black people in the United States. Now, in some cases, jazz is related not only to dancing, but also, or even, as in the case of Jorge Guillén, to social criticism, but it is sometimes also linked to a failed love relationship. And that is the case of this book by José Moreno Villa. It's called Jacinta la Pelirroja, which means Jacinta, the redhead. He wrote this entire volume devoted to reflecting on his failed relationship with an American woman whom he calls Jacinta. Of course, the name was not Jacinta, but he hides the name by using just the Spanish name Jacinta. They met in Madrid, and they traveled together to New York City to meet her parents and announce their engagement. But her parents were opposed to their marriage, and the two of them ended up going their separate ways and Moreno Villa returned to Spain without what appears to have been the love of his life. He does reflect upon that later on in his autobiography as well, how this was the love of his life, and he could not overcome it, or it was hard for him to do so. And the early poems in this collection reflect the excitement of newfound love. For example, in a very famous poem that starts this collection, he says something like, "That's it, I'll dance with her, the broken black rhythm of jazz, Europe for America." So Europe and America meeting through not only jazz, but also his relationship with this woman. He also addresses Jacinta, whose hair was red, she is the pelirroja, the redhead in the title, by using the word pelirroja in a syncopated way, imitating the rhythm of the music. So at some point he goes all syncopated and he says, "Oh, Jacinta, pelirroja, pelirroja, pelirrojiza." So trying to imitate the syncopation of jazz. Of course, when the relationship ends, mostly due to the opposition of Jacinta's well-to-do New York family, the poet finds solace in the sounds of jazz. It's not excitement anymore, but it's solace. And so in another poem in this collection, he writes the following: "I would like to die, having been a poet, a carpenter, a painter, a philosopher, a lover, a bullfighter. And a black singer, performing the jazz that I feel through 10 layers underground." So that's Jose Moreno Villa, very interesting writer about whom not a lot has been written, unfortunately. He was also a very good, important art critic and a painter himself. You obviously will know the name of Federico Garcia Lorca, and he was an author who, like Moreno Villa, also got to visit the United States in the 1920s. Yes, and he reflected on his experiences also in New York City in a collection entitled Poeta en Nueva York, or Poet in New York. While in New York, he got a chance to interact with writers like Langston Hughes, like Nella Larson. He was very good friends with Nella Larson, apparently. And he was exposed to jazz in some of the clubs in Harlem. I think he even got to see Duke Ellington play live at Harlem. Lorca also witnessed the racism and the segregation that existed in America. And in some of the poems in that collection, he links the plight of African Americans in the U.S. with that of the gypsies, los gitanos, in Spain. And this is a topic about which he often wrote in several of his most famous works. So Federico Garcia Lorca is another example of a writer that at some point in his life, he was also a musicologist. He played the piano, played several instruments, and he was very much influenced by the new rhythms of jazz. But of course, in 1936, the Spanish Civil War breaks out. It'll come to an end in 1939 with the victory of the nationalist troops led by the General Francisco Franco, and this marks the beginning of a fascist-leaning dictatorship that would last until the passing of Franco in 1975. So he wasn't overthrown, but he actually lived to see the end of his dictatorship with his death. Now, right after the Spanish Civil War, after 1939, in the 1940s, that was a very dire post-war period that wasn't conducive to the popularity of jazz in Spain. And even though they didn't quite get to the point of the Nazis' ban on jazz, the Nazis thought that jazz was unerwünschte Musik, which means undesirable music. The Francoist government didn't necessarily think that exactly, but they were generally against a type of music that came from the United States and that had an African-American origin. So few poems influenced by jazz were written in this period as a result. Although one of them was one of the first that paid tribute to a specific jazz musician. Who do you think that jazz musician would be? The answer is Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong was synonymous with jazz for a lot of these writers. This is a poem by Salvador Espriu called Spiritual with the Trumpet of Louis Armstrong, a poem with powerful lines of social criticism that are uncharacteristic of such a time of political repression. And he says things that are very shocking but that can be understood in the context of the post-war period in Spain. For example, one of his poems says, this one called Spiritual with the Trumpet of Louis Armstrong, "You should not be moved, straight thinker, if you see clearer and darker skin. I'll tell you, the black man is a brother to the white man. So then when you hang them, you'll learn to cry." The violence against African Americans in the United States is linked here and compared with the violence exerted by the winning side in the Spanish Civil War against the people who lost the Civil War and had to stay in Spain. And this is, again, an example of how jazz is used for social criticism in Spain at this time. Another poet associated with the post-war period, Gabriel Celaya, mentions Louis Armstrong again in a series of poems under the heading of jazz, in which the music reflects the loneliness and pain that he feels in the social and political context that he has to endure. So this is more of an kind of like an intimist sort of poem. And he says in this poem, "A warm sound slowly ascends, almost gurgling, breathless on the sax. The piano grits its teeth and is accompanied by a crying, delirious trumpet. The drums sound out of this world, and the violin weeps behind some wall. I am as alone, my friends, as that clarinet, and as much in love as the trombone. I am as crazy, my friends, as the drums." So he uses jazz in order to reflect upon his feelings in this dire post-war period in Spain. Not many poems written about jazz at that time, but in the 1950s, things start to change. Slowly, but they do change a little bit. And the 50s and 60s can be seen as a transition of sorts, a time when jazz started to become more accepted, and it began to turn up more regularly in poems written in these years. Jazz is used often as a vehicle to reflect on the past, to express feelings of loneliness, yearning, dissatisfaction. And as the 50s give way to the 60s, some poems start to become more overtly political and to voice concern over social issues more clearly. Now, many of the authors are now familiar with the few jazz clubs that open up in Madrid and in Barcelona. And in these spaces, in the clubs, jazz is still the soundtrack of the city, of the nightlife, and of love lost or found. And little by little, jazz will gain access to the media in Spain, to radio, even to television. Some written publications about jazz begin to appear in Spain, and visiting American musicians like Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong, Don Baez, the saxophonist, and several others appear live in some Spanish cities. In the mid-60s, even Quincy Jones, this is a bossa nova album that he made, Quincy Jones plays live with his orchestra on Spanish TV. It's pretty interesting. And as a result of all this, the authors become more knowledgeable about jazz, about its practitioners. And the music stops being just a sort of an abstract entity that we just don't know much about, but we kind of like, you know. They know more about jazz. And many poems start to reference specific jazz musicians and even specific recordings. And the readers can appreciate these compositions much better if they are familiar with the music that they reference, and many of them actually were. I'm going to give you a few examples. For instance, Alfredo Papo, his work to publicize jazz in many different ways in Catalonia, is invaluable. Alfredo Papo, in this poem, he celebrates the music of the great trumpeter Cootie Williams. Cootie Williams is right here with on this album, The Big Challenge, with Rex Stewart. Well, he has a poem called Cootie, about Cootie Williams, and he says, "Your trumpet, Cootie, is like thunder. Your trumpet, Cootie, calls for lightning. Your trumpet, Cootie, is like revenge." So you see the references to the weather, to the storm and all that, but then there's also a reference to revenge, and it's clearly done on purpose in this context of the 1950s and 60s. Then we have Jaime Ferran, who celebrates the music of John Coltrane, John Coltrane is here with Milt Jackson, the vibraphone player. And while celebrating the music of John Coltrane, he describes it as another link in the chain of the African American musical tradition, and he does it in a very beautiful way. This was hard for me to translate, but the poem in Spanish is even more beautiful, I think. He says in this poem, Jaime Ferran, "In the beginning it was rhythm and sadness in the cotton fields of Louisiana, on Basin Street. Later, much later, came from the depths of a mutilated soul an ascending impulse, pure mysticism. The rhythm, not unbound anymore, serves the fervor, kneels down, and for 10 years, since 1957, the soprano saxophone of John Coltrane shows a forgotten path." And when he says an ascending impulse, it's done on purpose because one of the main labels for which John Coltrane recorded was Impulse Records. So these writers know more about jazz, more and more and more and more about jazz as time goes by. And they could do subtle things like that. They wouldn't be able to do that in the 20s. This type of references to several jazz musicians abound really in the 50s and 60s. José Corredor Mateos, for example, writes about Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald, who recorded a couple of really good albums together. José Ángel Valente mentions the piano of Thelonious Monk. Fernando Quiñones celebrates Charlie Parker. And Antonio Gamoneda describes the powerful emotions that he feels upon listening to Lady Day, to Billie Holiday, in these terms. This is also a very beautiful poem that I think sounds a lot better in the original Spanish. "Memory is mortal. Some afternoons, Billie Holiday places her sick rose in my ears. Some afternoons, I surprise myself far away from myself, weeping." That's Antonio Gamoneda in one of his, I think, most powerful poems. But then the music of Billie Holiday is very powerful when one listens to her voice. And that's what he's trying to channel for this poem here. The 1970s are important as well. And between the 1970s and the present day, all of this that I'm talking about is getting to be more and more intensified by the arrival of the group of poets known as Los Novísimos, the very new, in the late 60s and early 70s. They were mostly born in the post-war period in the 40s, and they are, in many cases, jazz fans, jazz enthusiasts who have been exposed to the music and who are aware of its history and mythology and significance. And for that reason, musicians like Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker, here's Charlie Parker, the album's Now's the Time. One of the poems is actually titled after this album, Now's the Time. Musicians like Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker are celebrated by Los Novísimos, not only for their music, but also for their iconic nature and for the tragic lives that they led. These writers know a lot about the lives of these musicians now, and so that becomes an element of their poetry as well. And in their poems, these authors blur the boundaries between high and popular culture, referencing not only jazz, but also movies, popular literature, and all kinds of popular music. They introduce names such as Duke Ellington, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, saxophonist Stan Getz, and even lesser-known musicians like the drummer Joe Jones or the British pianist George Shearing, or one of the greatest saxophonists in my opinion, which is Sonny Stitt. And they become models for later generations of poets whose use of jazz will become the centerpiece of some of their works. Sometimes there are complete poetry collections devoted or inspired by jazz. One example, Pere Jim Ferrer from Catalonia, he used to write his poems while listening to jazz, he used to say. And in his song for Billie Holiday again, he strings images together in a way that seems to bring to mind the improvisation of jazz solos, also referencing one of Holiday's most famous songs, and most powerful songs too, called Strange Fruit. And it's not by chance is this collection, this anthology called Fruta Extraña, which means strange fruit. And Jim Ferrer writes, Lady Day. Herd swallows return to the harbor lights. Strange fruit absent in the air at dusk. With a sword, with a glove, with a crystal ball, the magnetic fishbowl, the cave of the past, the submarine under the tides that glow. So, kind of like stringing the images together in the manner of an improvised jazz solo. And as jazz becomes the soundtrack of entire poetry collections, poems usually celebrate specific musicians, sometimes in a cryptic, in a roundabout way, and often referencing certain recordings made famous by these musicians. One example is Rafael Calero Palma, who describes John Coltrane as a kind of soothsayer, as a visionary who is in possession of the absolute truth. And he says, regarding John Coltrane, describing him in this poem, tenor sax, free jazz and bebop, blue train in eternal motion, prophet of improvisation. From LA to New York, one hears on black streets a sax solo, that call to revolution. Only you know the truth. Of course, Blue Train, one of the greatest albums by John Coltrane, and it's talking about free jazz, talking about bebop, so he is aware of all the different styles and trends within jazz. And like Jack Kerouac and others before him, Iván Caraballo dedicates a series of haikus to some of the jazz musicians that have most influenced him. If you remember, Jack Kerouac really enjoyed writing haikus, just like a lot of the beat poets. And one of these haikus by Iván Caraballo celebrates pianist Art Tatum. Art Tatum is right here on this album with Lionel Hampton and drummer Buddy Rich. He's celebrating Iván Caraballo, Art Tatum in these terms. This is just a haiku, and I'm going to read it in English and then in Spanish. On the piano, due to the sound of silence, my hands dance. And of course, the hands of Art Tatum danced all over the 88 keys. In Spanish, en el piano, porque suena el silencio, bailan mis manos. It even rhymes in the Spanish version. I'm close to finishing here because I would like to see if you have any comments or any questions, but let me just read you two more poems, because many poets belonging to the younger generations, those born in the 70s or like me in the 80s, also some of the others in the 90s particularly, some of these poets belonging to the younger generations, they are aware of the existence of a tradition within jazz, a tradition that transcends the music and that extends also to literature and also to cinema. And for example, Rodrigo Olay, a poet who is several years younger than I am, he references the undeniable link that exists between jazz and the writers of the beat generation like Kerouac or Ginsberg in a poem entitled precisely Beat Generation. And he says in this poem, to escape, the road, a Chevrolet, some records and some books, San Francisco, Lucky Strike, the waitress from another bar, the entire night awake, acid, the sea, Miles Davis, Korea, howling at the horizon, writing because we are going to die, but we were able to love. So here the references are to Jack Kerouac's On the Road, of course, Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and they appear here side by side with the names of some jazz musicians, Miles Davis, pianist Chick Corea. When I said Korea, I didn't mean Korea the country, I meant Chick Corea, the piano player. And jazz, with the C. And jazz is seen not only as the driving force behind the works of the beats, but also as one among many iconic elements from America. There's others, Lucky Strike, Chevrolet, etc. And finally, Miguel Serrano Larraz, also a young poet, while devoting an entire poem to saxophone colossus Sonny Rollins, he's right here in one of his earlier albums, on Prestige Records. He devotes an entire poem to him, to Sonny Rollins, and he references both one of his recordings, not this one, but another one called The Bridge, and I have it, but I just couldn't find it, and that's why I couldn't bring it. But he references The Bridge, one of the recordings by Sonny Rollins, and he also references the saxophone playing protagonist of Julio Cortázar's El Perseguidor. This is a novella about a saxophonist in Paris called Johnny Carter, who is very clearly referencing Charlie Parker. And in this novella, Johnny Carter, at some point, he's recording some sort of jam session, and at some point in the novella, he says, "No, I'm not going to play that. I already played that tomorrow. I already played that tomorrow." There is a reference to this in this final poem that I'm going to read by Miguel Serrano Larraz, and it goes like this. It says, "Something's wrong. I already understood that yesterday. I don't want to repeat myself. I can't stand people who repeat themselves. I'd rather retire than repeat myself. I'd rather hide than repeat myself. I prefer poverty. I even prefer bridges. You have to be absolutely modern. You can't ever give less than your all. Something's wrong. I already understood that yesterday. I don't want to repeat myself." All of those are references to Cortázar, references The Bridge to Sonny Rollins, and of course, he keeps talking about not wanting to repeat himself. Well, of course, repeating himself over and over and over again. Now, I don't want to repeat myself, so I'll just end it right now, and I appreciate your listening to all these poems. And if you have any questions, I think now, as Charlie Parker would say, now's the time for the questions. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.